Chapter 1 continued. Massachusetts. Henry Hill, Colored Americans on Bunker Hill. Seymour Burr, Jeremy Jonah, a brave colored artillerist. Governor Hancock's flag. Big Dick. Henry Hill, a colored man and a Revolutionary soldier, died in Chillicothe on the 12th of August, 1833, aged 80 years. He was buried with the honors of war, a singular tribute of respect to the memory of a colored man, but no doubt richly merited in this case. Henry, I should infer from an obituary notice in the Chillicothe Advertiser, was at the Battle of Lexington, Brandywine, Monmouth, Princeton, and Yorktown. Sweat, in his Sketches of Bunker Hill Battle, alludes to the presence of a colored man in that fight. He says, quote, Major Pitcairn caused the first effusion of blood at Lexington. In that battle, his horse was shot under him, while he was separated from his troops. With presence of mind, he feigned himself slain, his pistols were taken from his holsters, and he was left for dead, when he seized the opportunity and escaped. He appeared at Bunker Hill and, says the historian, among those who mounted the works was the gallant Major Pitcairn, who exultantly cried out, "The day is ours," when a black soldier named Salem shot him through, and he fell. His agonized son received him in his arms, and tenderly bore him to the boats. A contribution was made in the army for the colored soldier, and he was presented to Washington as having performed this feat. See footnote. Begin footnote. In some engravings of the battle, this colored soldier occupies a prominent position, but in more recent editions, his figure is non est inventus. A significant, but inglorious omission. On some bills, however, of the Monumental Bank, Charlestown, and Freeman's Bank, Boston, his presence is manifest. End footnote. Besides Salem, there were quite a number of colored soldiers at Bunker Hill. Among them, Titus Coburn, Alexander Ames, and Barzillai Lew, all of Andover, and also Cato Howe, of Plymouth, each of whom received a pension. Lew was a fifer. His daughter, Mrs. Dalton, now lives within a few rods of the battlefield. Seymour Burr was a slave in Connecticut to a brother of Colonel Aaron Burr, from whom he derived his name. Though treated with much favor by his master, his heart yearned for liberty, and he seized an occasion to induce several of his fellow slaves to escape in a boat, intending to join the British, that they might become freemen, but being pursued by their owners, armed with the implements of death, they were compelled to surrender. Burr's master, contrary to his expectation, did not inflict corporal punishment, but reminded him of the kindness with which he had been treated, and asked what inducement he could have for leaving him. Burr replied that he wanted his liberty. His owner finally proposed that if he would give him the bounty money, he might join the American army, and at the end of the war be his own man. Burr, willing to make any sacrifice for his liberty, consented, and served faithfully during the campaign, attached to the 7th Regiment, commanded by Colonel, afterwards Governor Brooks, of Medford. He was present at the siege of Fort Catskill, and endured much suffering from starvation and cold. After some skirmishing, the army was relieved by the arrival of General Washington, who, as witnessed by him, shed tears of joy on finding them unexpectedly safe. Burr married one of the Ponkapog tribe of Indians, and settled in Canton, Massachusetts. He received a pension from government. His widow died in 1852, aged over 100 years. Jeremy Jonah served in the same regiment, Colonel Brooks's, at the same time with Seymour Burr. The two veterans used to make merry together in recounting their military adventures, especially the drill on one occasion, when Jonah stumbled over a stone heap, for which he was severely caned by the colonel. He drew a pension. Lemuel Burr, grandson of Seymour, a resident of Boston, often speaks of their reminiscences of Deborah Gannett. In confirmation of this part of their history, I give the following extract from the resolves of the General Court of Massachusetts during the session of 1791. 23. Resolve on the petition of Deborah Gannett, granting her £34 for services in the Continental Army, January 20th, 1792. On the petition of Deborah Gannett, praying for compensation for services performed in the late Army of the United States. Whereas, it appears to this court that the said Deborah Gannett enlisted, under the name of Robert Shirtliff, in Captain Webb's company, in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment, on May 20th, 1782, and did actually perform the duty of a soldier in the late Army of the United States to the 23rd day of October, 1783, for which she has received no compensation, and whereas it further appears that the said Deborah exhibited an extraordinary instance of female heroism by discharging the duties of a faithful, gallant soldier, and at the same time preserving the virtue and chastity of her sex, unsuspected and unblemished, and was discharged from the service with a fair and honorable character. Therefore, resolved, that the Treasurer of this Commonwealth be, and he hereby is, directed to issue his note to the said Deborah for the sum of £34, bearing interest from October 23, 1783. Joshua B. Smith has stated to me that he was present at a company of distinguished Massachusetts men when the conversation turned upon the exploits of Revolutionary times, and that the late Judge Story related an incident of a colored artillerist who, while having charge of a cannon with a white fellow soldier, was wounded in one arm. He immediately turned to his comrade and proposed changing his position, exclaiming that he had yet one arm left with which he could render some service to his country. The change proved fatal to the heroic soldier, for another shot from the enemy killed him upon the spot. Judge Story furnished other incidents of the bravery of colored soldiers, adding that he had often thought them and their descendants too much neglected, considering the part they had sustained in the wars, and he regretted that he did not, in early life, gather the facts into a shape for general information. The late Governor Eustis of Massachusetts, the pride and boast of the democracy of the East, himself an active participant in the war, and therefore a most competent witness, states that the free colored soldiers entered the ranks with the whites. The time of those who were slaves was purchased of their masters, and they were induced to enter the service in consequence of a law of Congress, by which, on condition of their serving in the ranks during the war, they were made freemen. This hope of liberty inspired them with fresh courage to oppose their breasts to the Hessian bayonet at Red Bank, and enabled them to endure with fortitude the cold and famine of Valley Forge. At the close of the Revolutionary War, John Hancock presented the colored company, called the Bucks of America, with an appropriate banner, bearing his initials, as a tribute to their courage and devotion throughout the struggle. The Bucks, under the command of Colonel Middleton, were invited to a collation in the neighboring town and en route were requested to halt in front of the Hancock mansion in Beacon Street, where the governor and his son united in the above presentation. Lydia Maria Child gives the following sketch of Colonel Middleton, commander of the Bucks. Quote, Colonel Middleton was not a very good specimen of the colored man. He was an old horsebreaker who owned a house that he inhabited at the end of Belknap Street. He was greatly respected by his own people, and his house was thronged with company. His morals were questioned. He was passionate, intemperate, and profane. We lived opposite to him for 5 years. During all this time, my father treated this old Negro with uniform kindness. He had a natural compassion for the ignorant and the oppressed, and I never knew him fail to lift his hat to this old neighbor, and audibly say, with much suavity, "How do you do, Colonel Middleton?" or "Good morning, Colonel." My father would listen to the dissonant sounds that came from an old violin that the Colonel played on every summer's evening, and was greatly amused at his power in subduing meddlesome colts. He would walk over and compliment the Colonel on his skill in his hazardous employment, and the Colonel would, when thus praised, urge the untamed animal to some fearful caper to show off his own bold daring. Our Negroes for many years were allowed peacefully to celebrate the abolition of the slave trade, but it became a frolic with the white boys to deride them on this day, and finally they determined to drive them on these occasions from the common. The colored people became greatly incensed at this mockery of their festival, and this infringement on their liberty, and a rumor reached us, on one of these anniversaries, that they were determined to resist the whites, and were going armed with this intention. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a shout of a beginning fray reached us. Soon, terrified children and women ran down Belknap Street, pursued by white boys, who enjoyed their fright. The sounds of battle approached. Clubs and brickbats were flying in all directions. At this crisis, Colonel Middleton opened his door, armed with a loaded musket, and in a loud voice, shrieked death to the first white who should approach. Hundreds of human beings, white and black, were pouring down the street, the blacks making but a feeble resistance, the odds in numbers and spirit being against them. Colonel Middleton's voice could be heard above every other, urging his party to turn and resist to the last. His appearance was terrific, his musket was leveled, ready to sacrifice the first white man that came within its range. The colored party, shamed by his reproaches, and fired by his example, rallied, and made a short show of resistance. Captain Winslow Lewis and my father determined to try and quell this tumult. Captain Lewis valiantly grappled with the ringleaders of the whites, and my father coolly surveyed the scene from his own door, and instantly determined what to do. He calmly approached Colonel Middleton, who called to him to stop, or he was a dead man. I can still see my father at this distance of time, and never can forget the feelings his family expressed, as they saw him still approaching this armed man. He put aside his musket, and with his countenance all serenity, said a few soothing words to the colonel, who burst into tears, put up his musket, and with great emotion exclaimed, loud enough for us to hear across the street, "I will do it for you have always been kind to me," and retired to his own house, and shut his door upon the scene. When a boy living in West Boston, I was familiar with the person of Big Dick, and have heard the following account of him, which is taken from the Boston Patriot, confirmed. It is not wholly out of place in this collection. Richard Sievers, said that journal, a few days after his decease, "was a man of mighty mold. A short time previous to his death, he measured 6 foot 5 inches in height, and attracted much attention when seen in the street. He was born in Salem, or vicinity, and when about 16 years old, went to England, where he entered the British Navy. When the War of 1812 broke out, he would not fight against his country, gave himself up as an American citizen, and was made a prisoner of war. A surgeon on board an American privateer, who experienced the tender mercies of the British government in Dartmoor prison, during the War of 1812, makes honorable mention of King Dick, as he was there called. There are about 450 Negroes in prison number 4, and this assemblage of blacks affords many curious anecdotes, and much matter for speculation. These blacks have a ruler among them, whom they call King Dick. He is by far the largest, and I suspect, the strongest man in the prison. He is 6 foot 5 inches in height, and proportionably large. This black Hercules commands respect, and his subjects tremble in his presence. He goes the rounds every day, and visits every berth to see if they are all kept clean. When he goes the rounds, he puts on a large bearskin cap, and carries in his hand a huge club. If any of his men are dirty, drunken, or grossly negligent, he threatens them with a beating, and if they are saucy, they are sure to receive one. They have several times conspired against him, and attempted to dethrone him, but he has always conquered the rebels. One night, several attacked him, while asleep in his hammock. He sprang up and seized the smallest of them by his feet, and thumped another with him. The poor Negro who had thus been made a beetle of, was carried next day to the hospital, sadly bruised, and provokingly laughed at. This ruler of the blacks, this King Richard IV, is a man of good understanding, and he exercises it to a good purpose. If any one of his color cheats, defrauds, or steals from his comrades, he is sure to be punished for it." Charles Bowles, says his biographer, the Reverend John W. Lewis, "was born in Boston 1761. His father was an African, his mother was a daughter of the celebrated Colonel Morgan, who was distinguished as an officer in the Rifle Corps of the American Army during the Revolutionary struggle for independence. At the early age of 12, he was placed in the family of a Tory, but his young heart did not fancy his new situation, for at the tender age of 14, we find him serving in the colonial army, in the capacity of waiter to an officer. He remained in this situation for 2 years, and then enlisted, a mere boy, in the American army, to risk his life in defense of the holy cause of liberty. He served during the entire war, after which he went to New Hampshire and engaged in agricultural pursuits. He succeeded in drawing a pension, became a Baptist preacher, and died March 16, 1843, aged 82." End of chapter 1, part 2.